as a professor, it's like I find it now hard to talk in like 15-minute increments, and it's like give me the hour and a half to like 3 hour increments.
Because
I feel pretty comfortable.
so what do you teach?
A variety of things, design studio, software courses in Grasshopper, Rhino, Midjourney, teaching a design media course
Hmm.
for about all of the freshmen. So this year it's about 115 freshmen on just kind of, it's called Introduction to Design Media. So each week I do a different form of media and give kind of the history of that media and how it developed maybe outside of the discipline, and then how the discipline kind of began to use it, how it was used previously, how it's used now, where it might be going in the future. So it's like I think 14 different types of media, from sketching to photography. Was it last week? Mapping was last week. Tomorrow is kind of responsive systems,
Hmm. Hmm.
the form of media. So kind of all over the place. And then I do a 1 hour tutorial on that form of media on every Thursday.
Wow.
You're making me miss school, which is impressive.
Yeah.
That sounds really cool. So how many hours a week is that class? I'm curious.
Unfortunately, it's only two,
Mm.
but part of the reason I was hired was that they knew they needed to catch up
Mm.
on media, and I needed some more kind of strategic oversight of it. When I came here in 2020, like sorry, right before the pandemic, January 2020, they didn't have a laptop requirement,
Oh,
Mm.
and students, but they had kind of given up, like the Mayline, like, so older students were oddly either using Revit or using a Mayline.
wow.
Okay.
And
Okay.
um, so but no one was teaching Revit. It was more that they were, in an absence of any teaching on media, they were just accepting what they were picking up from their part-time jobs and summer jobs and things like that.
Hmm.
So I think there was, um, I think some people have a misperception about like younger generations of being like digitally native,
Mm.
and that because they, have been brought up around phones and video games and so on and so forth, that they'll just take to technology easily.
Hmm.
And I think that's true in very minor cases, but it's like a lot of the software that we use within architecture is it, it's not as easy as jumping into an app, or at least most of them.
Yeah.
And So I think a lot of faculty felt like, oh, they can just look on YouTube if they need to learn something. And it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, you can, but you're not gonna like like it should be integrated into a design environment, into like, why are you using this tool,
Hmm.
and not just throw them to the wolves and let them figure out, what tool they think they should use.
Yeah.
So anyway, a lot of my job here at the moment is just trying to restructure the curriculum.
Well, that's very
But
exciting. And
yeah.
that's also a really good point. I think it is easier for younger generations to get into computer programs, but only in the sense that they know how to use a computer and not
Yeah.
the software. I mean, it is. I mean, SketchUp is kind of the easiest tool to use, but like Rhino or even AutoCAD and certainly any BIM program, it's a different kind of way of understanding the system of the computer program and how it's
Mhm.
structured. And that's, I mean, yeah, you're right. You could learn anything by YouTube, I suppose, but should you?
Exactly.
Without
Because
going
it's like,
nuts?
yeah, it's like the students are paying for an education. Like,
Right,
you know,
right.
so it's like, yeah, anyone can learn anything. You could learn probably law on YouTube. You could learn almost anything on YouTube, but it's maybe not the best way to learn. And it's not a very focused way to learn.
Yeah,
It's not, it's like, it's kind of a hodgepodge of whatever the algorithm kind of sends you based on your search. And it's not
Yeah.
like someone's constructing a pedagogy for you that makes a lot of sense.
mm,
So yeah. Anyway, it's interesting. Kind of, yeah, trying to figure out. I haven't taught freshmen. I mean, for the last 3 years, I've now taught freshmen every year, but prior to that, I hadn't taught freshmen since like 2007.
Hmm.
So but I'm really enjoying it.
That's great. And I think we're definitely going to dive into more of that story. But I do want to
Mhm.
pick up on something you mentioned, which is you're teaching
I was
Midjourney.
just going to ask that.
So,
Yeah.
as I said prior to us hitting the record button, a lot of people have
Hmm.
been messaging us saying, "Can you please talk about AI in design
Hmm.
and Midjourney?" And we know very little about both of those things, frankly. So, can you, I guess, give us a dumb, simple introduction to what Midjourney is? And I'm also curious,
Hmm.
eventually, I'm fascinated that it's being taught, actually.
So Midjourney is one of many text to image generators that you enter in a short phrase or a paragraph, and it looks at the words and sometimes even subwords in that phrase or that paragraph, and it has a model that's been trained on uh, pretty much a lot of what's on the internet, for good
Hmm.
or bad. And that model has learned the connections based on captions and alt text and things like that between images and words. So it then produces a field of noise, kind of like, so there's like two parts to it. Maybe back up a little bit.
Hmm.
So when it's training, you're probably familiar with in Photoshop, Gaussian blur
Yeah.
filter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, just like blurs things, and you can do it like 1 pixel, 10 pixels, so forth. And it gets increasingly blurry.
Hmm.
So when the model is being trained, it's essentially applying Gaussian blur to the image, but in increments. So it first looks at the image, looks at the words that's associated with the image, and then blurs it a little bit. And then it does it again and does it again and does it again until it's pure noise. And what it takes from that, it doesn't, after it's trained, it doesn't save anything about the image. It just saves kind of the training, if that makes sense. So it actually saves like less than 1 byte per image that it's trained on.
Hmm.
So it actually can't ever reconstruct any of the images that it was trained on. But after looking at, millions or billions of images, I guess in this case, that it has learned in a way like what like treeness is, let's say. So like
Treeness, as in like the essence of tree.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. So like in the same way, I don't want to anthropomorphize it too much, but because there's lots of important differences. But if I asked you to draw a picture of a tree that you saw yesterday, you probably wouldn't be able to do it. And if I asked you to do it, a picture from a tree you saw when you were 5, you also probably wouldn't be able to do it. And that as humans, very, very few people have photographic memory. And even then, it's not really photographic memory. It's just like slightly better memory. And what we tend to do is like I don't know what our refresh rate is for our eyes, but we're ingesting incredible amounts of information all the time, and our brains are throwing out most of that. And so like when we see a tree, like we don't memorize every single placement of every leaf or anything like that. We may not even notice it. Like if I asked you, did you walk by an oak tree yesterday? You probably wouldn't be able to say if you did or not, right? But every time we see something, yeah, like I said, most of it's probably thrown away, but some of it is our brain recognizes a pattern in it. Like that's a tree, that's a car, that's a friend. I recognize that face or something like that. And it just needs to kind of know that amount of information. So the AI models do something similar where it's kind of remembering kind of this process of how something can be turned into noise. And in the same, so if you think of like it as a translation that going from an image into pure noise, and it knows how to take something that looks like a tree and eventually move it into pure noise. And it's looked at millions of different trees, and some of those trees had a species associated with it. Some of those trees had a sunset behind them, some of them didn't, and all of that information is being kind of learned in a way that you can recognize that it can recognize the patterns of treeness in these different scenarios. So, but it doesn't remember any of the specific trees that it's looked at. It just it's building up a model of what a tree is in its model. If like we all have a model in our own heads of what a tree is and what an oak tree is versus a pine tree and so forth. So that's the training. Okay, so then when a user wants to use it, there's another part of the model where it's kind of the opposite in a way, where the algorithm produces noise, and then this other part of the model looks at that noise and says, the user has written this thing about trees and sunsets and things like that. In that noise, if I squint really hard in a way, do I see a tree in that noise? So again, not to anthropomorphize it too much, but like if you were to look at a cloud, at first you might not see anything but a cloud. But if your friend laying next to you says, "Oh, do you see that dog in the cloud?" And if you squint, you're like, "I can kind of see the dog. Is that the ear? Is that the tail?" And that slowly you begin to kind of have this pattern recognition that part of your brain that has dogness in it and that other part of your brain that has cloudness in it kind of converge together, and you can make out the dog in the cloud. So it looks at that noise and then says, okay, I think I see something that might possibly at this super fuzzy state be a dog or be a tree in the sunset or whatever I said a moment ago. And so then it denoises. So if you think of that translation, that if you can go, like if you learn how to speak another language, like if I learn Spanish, let's say, I could translate into English into Spanish, but I could also translate Spanish back in English. So it's a similar thing that the model has learned how to go from image into noise. So it's also in a way learned how to go from noise into image. And it uses this other part of the model that's called clip, that is good at recognizing patterns in noise. Or in images in general. So it says, okay, now I see this fuzzy thing that possibly might be a tree at sunset. So I'm going to denoise it towards that a little bit more. And then it says, okay, do I see more of it now? And it denoises it again and again. These are called steps. So it depends on the software, but anywhere between 20 and 50 steps is like a normal, I'd say, range. And it basically, the more steps you do, the more refined it is, but it also takes more processing time. So it's kind of do you want to spend more money on it? Do you really need it or not?
So a few questions with that. Well, first of all, this is super fascinating, really, really interesting. But what I was going to ask is, so the denoising in the different steps that you mentioned. Now, are we talking about if I hit, I don't know, render or submit, whatever the button is, that the image itself is actually becoming less fuzzy in the sense of blurring, like actual blurriness, or is that more to do with refinement of composition, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so it's maybe somewhere in between that. So the first, if you just have it go one step, it's really blurry noise. And then it looks at, so it's like an iterative process. So then it looks at that. And when it looks at that, it might see something completely different. It might, like what it initially saw, let's say there was like a building next to a tree in the sunset. So after that initial step, it might be like, okay, I see a building in the middle and there's a tree next to it. And then maybe it refines it more. But in that refinement, somehow now that tree looks a little bit more like an addition onto the building. And that's maybe in the center. So maybe that second step, it looks at it anew in a way, like it looks at it with fresh eyes and says, what do I see now? Do I see more of what the is in the prompt? And it keeps on doing that over and over again. And as it becomes more refined, fewer changes happen each time, but they can happen from yeah. So it's a little different. Like when you're used to like rendering in, you know, V-Ray or any other rendering software, and you get this kind of noisy
version,
version of the rendering. But like, and each time there's another iteration on the rendering, it gets less noisy. It's not quite like that
Gotcha.
with AI, that it's actually looking at it new each time, and you might get something radically different. Maybe not radically different between like step 1 and step 21, but it might change. And it also has to do with the complexity of your prompt, I'd say too, sometimes. Like the things at the beginning of the prompt are, they're kind of like the thesis statement. Like they're the things that the model's going to kind of obsess over a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And the things at the end of the paragraph, it tends to not think about as much. So in the first few steps, you might not see anything that is, relates to the end of the statement of the prompt. It'll be more what's in the beginning.
Yeah.
And then related to that, words that just show up more on the internet, it knows better. So that's really weird too, where it's like, if you put a red, like it knows what redness is very clearly. But if you put, I don't know, like the Spanish mid-century architect Miguel Pisac in, who he's one of my big inspirations, it has no idea what I'm talking about. So,
fascinating.
So, I mean, which is, it's to be expected. Like it's the same thing with humans, right? Like you talk to a friend and you mention a fairly obscure architect, they might not know what you're talking about. But if you say the word red, they'll probably know what you're talking about.
So
Gotcha.
is the process kind of like I give the AI the text and it just like in itself like does a bunch of iteration, or do you have control throughout the process on those iterations
between the steps?
Between step 5 and step 21, or you just kind of like letting do his thing?
It happens very quickly. Okay. So within it depends on what platform. But like, so Midjourney, I'd say is a little slower. And it might take, depending on how much your subscription is, basically, if it's like a lower subscription or you've run out of credit hours within that month of your subscription, it goes very slow. Like it might take a couple of minutes, and every, 10 seconds, maybe it'll send you an update on what the rendering or what the image looks like, but you have no ability to intervene in that process while it's generating it. Once it's generated, though, before I get to that, like Stable Diffusion, I'd say it's another platform, like a competitor to Midjourney, and it's much faster, and it within, it'll generate 4 different options within 3 or 4 seconds, probably.
Oh,
so you don't have like time to intervene anyway. And I guess that's not really the point. It's like you're given 4 options or 8 options, however many you select, and then you see the results of those. And then there's just a lot of decisions that have to happen at that point, where you're like, okay, do any of these make sense? Do any of these, are they close to what I wanted? Or are they not at all what I wanted, but maybe better or different at least? Maybe they change the way you think about what you wanted. Or maybe they're like close to what you wanted, but not quite. So then you might want to go back and change something in the prompt to like change the order of a phrase around, so that maybe something is given more kind of weight, in the prompt. So then let's say you like one of those 4 images. So Midjourney gives you 4 in Stable Diffusion. You can choose between 1 and 9 within their Dream Studio interface. But it's open source. So a lot of people have created, their own user interfaces for Stable Diffusion. And one of the ones that I use, I don't even know what the limit is. I've never reached it, but I think you could probably put in 100 and it'll produce 100 different variations on that same prompt. So so basically if you like something, then you can create variations of it. Gotcha. So then the differences, what they're doing at that point is probably, I don't know under the hood, they haven't exactly said what's happening, but from a user's perspective, what's happening is that that initial noise field that is normally completely random for the first iteration, once you select something, they're just making subtle distinctions to that noise field so that it's like you have a seed then that's like going to kind of germinate into this image that is close to what you originally selected.
So,
but each time it looks at it the noise slightly differently. So it might, the composition would be roughly the same. Whereas in the first iteration, the composition of the 4 images might be radically different.
So I have like a bajillion questions right now.
Yeah.
So let's say I put in a prompt and it produces, I'd say 4 images, right? And I like one of those images. It's not perfect, but it's heading in the right direction. And so what you're saying is that the noise field which those 4 images came from, well, first of all, is that noise field always different depending basically on time of day? So if I were to enter the same prompt verbatim a day later or an hour later, would it produce 4 different images because I'm later, time has passed?
Well, even if you did it 2 seconds later.
2 seconds later, okay.
But it also depends. So what you're asking is it deterministic or non-deterministic? So with Midjourney, well, I'd say for both Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, there are ways to force it to become more deterministic in the same way that like within Grasshopper or something, I don't know if you've used Grasshopper, but you can put seeds in for random number generators and things like that. Like we often as humans, we don't want purely random results because like if you're designing a facade and you wanted the placement of the windows to be slightly random, like when you open up your computer the next day, you don't want it to be a different random, arrangement of those windows. You want it the same as what you had yesterday. So for all random, either noise fields or random number generators, it's actually a pseudo randomness. We often don't want pure randomness. So what Midjourney does is there is a seed that's used for those initial 4 images, but it's like almost more like 4 different seeds, I'd say. That it's like one seed that's controlling 4, like asking for 4 random numbers for the 4 images. So if you then you like one of them, it's going to reuse that seed, but then do something to it to make it a little less like just a slight variation from it rather than the radical differences. I wouldn't say it's a problem because you could say it's a feature, but with Midjourney, it is non-deterministic in the end, though, that even if you use the same seed over and over and over again, you'll never get exactly the same image. There's like something in there where they've prevented it from getting the exact same thing every single time. So with Stable Diffusion, they have it's more deterministic. So if I gave you all the settings that I used, you could like which version of the model I used, what aspect ratio, what resolution, like the length and width or number of pixels in length and width, a bunch of other things, the number of steps, and the seed, you could create the exact same image with certain models. But yeah, I think it is because it's like it every single time I use it, like a friend of mine referred to it as like going to the casino, where it's like you just don't know. Like maybe you're gonna get lucky, maybe you won't. And in an interview with the CEO of Midjourney, David Holtz, actually wasn't an interview. He has every Wednesday he has a open office hours where on Discord where he kind of just opens up and allows users to talk to him about the software for about 3 hours, which is kind of amazing for a CEO to open themselves up that much. Because he talks about all the problems that they're having, all the, like technical problems, philosophical problems, ethical problems. Yeah, sorry. What is he said? Oh, no, I'm totally losing my train of thought.
Me too. So
yeah,
I know that we were talking about the indeterministic versus deterministic qualities. And as you were talking, I was wondering, why would you want it to be a system where you can replicate exactly the same image again? It seems to be the opposite of what the whole thing is built for.
Yeah. So I guess I could see it in that way, in that light too. But I think, let's say you were working on a project and you liked the results of it and you wanted to be able to come back to those results, or you wanted to share them. And just for like, even if you're not as a designer, but even as like a machine learning engineer, and you wanted to validate something that that someone is like, when you type in something, let's like take the worst case scenario. You type in something and it produces a horribly violent, racist image.
Okay,
and that was not at all the intent of the prompt, let's say. Like, you'd want to be able to share that and say, look at what happened.
I see.
You know, like there's like a way to go back and verify that there's like a problem in the system. So I think that's important. And I actually just remembered what David Holtz just said about that, the number of images. Actually, he said that he didn't, you know, he has his own kind of copy of Midjourney that he can test and do whatever with. And he, at the moment, for users, actually it changed slightly recently, but as of a few weeks ago, you could only create 4 variations at a time. And he said, this is, I think back in August, he said this. He's like, I've been playing around with a feature and I have it generate an 8x8 grid, so 64 images all at once of the same concept. And he's like, I find that really amazing to me as an artist, where like maybe something that I'm looking for, there's only a 1 in 64 chance of it happening. And if I have to do it 4 images at a time, it's going to take me a while to see that thing, and I'm going to get frustrated and I'll want to move on, or I'll change the prompt or something like that. He's like, but by looking at 64 images all at the same time, it's like easier to pick out that rare kind of specimen in a way, and then build off of that. And so I thought that was really interesting, where it's just like through the sheer quantity of different images and the randomness of it, that sometimes it might generate something that like truly inspires you to move in a different direction, or changes the way you're thinking about your prompt.
Yeah. That's, I mean, my first thinking goes toward a comparison between everything you're discussing and in a design office with employees and interns, when you're in the concept design phase and whatever it is, early design phase, and you're producing iterations, right? You can sit down and produce iteration A, and then you produce A1, A2, A3, A4, or if you're open-minded enough, or you have a bunch of, in some cases, places I worked at, a bunch of interns. Okay, everyone produced 5 versions of this thing, whatever, and let's say it's an art installation, which is even more open-ended. Just do whatever, right? And then you get, if you're the boss, 64 versions that probably take a lot longer to produce, and are much more expensive to produce.
Very expensive.
than what you're describing, I would imagine. Although we were paid pretty poorly, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are 2 parts of that. Part of it for me is I find it interesting that I've created around 30,000 images since last June, and which is, you know, I tend not to do many renderings anymore. I did it early in my career, like all the time, and I got kind of burnt out doing renderings, how tedious they were, and that you had to kind of, you know, model an entire thing, which means you have to design the entire thing before you can get a sense of its atmosphere, which seemed totally backwards to me, where it's like the thing that we really care about in the end is the atmosphere of a project, how it makes you feel. But we can't really know that until we model it and render it, or we just develop so much innate, you know, experience of visiting projects and all of that you'd gain through decades of experience. And so it was kind of frustrating to me that something that I felt was so important was always put at the very end, and it was almost more of like a PR marketing aspect to architecture than something that was essential to the design process. So flipping that around, I find it really interesting that I can generate a lot of different early kind of takes on an idea, and in a way they're cheap. It takes a lot to get used to that, because you look at these images and they're stunning and you're like, wow, that would have been like $1,000 to hire a visualization artist to do that. And I produced it in 3 seconds, and with the help of AI. And so part of that is like, what does that do to the design process? Like, if I can generate thousands of options really quickly and sort through them and help me figure out, like, kind of first explore my own imagination, but then narrow the different possibilities down. I think that to something, and then take a group of images and then do the really hard work in a way. Like, that's all the cheap kind of easy work in a way, which used to be really hard. But now it's like you have to take these phenomenal images and say, how are we actually going to produce that? Because that's what AI doesn't really do a good job of at all. Like, there's a ton of mistakes. Like, it doesn't know what perspective is. It knows how to simulate it, but doesn't know the rules of perspective. It doesn't know the difference, like the structural capacity of materials. It doesn't know anything about like building technology, really. It knows how to simulate an image that might look like it might work. But if you look at any AI produced images, you have like, well, I mean, the most famous one is like hands. Hands are really hard for AIs to produce. It's getting better, but more within architectural terms, like a lot of the images that I produce, like there'll be a column that looks like it's in like the background at the top of the image, and as it comes down, it looks like it's in the foreground. So there's like the Pyreneesian aspect to a lot of the images that I'm okay with in a way. Like, I think it's fine, because I'm not expecting it to produce a full design. I don't want it to produce it. I know it can't really produce a full design. It's like just helping inspire me and, like I said, explore my imagination. Yeah. But then I can do the hard work of actually translating that into geometry. So I kind of see it as like architecture before geometry, whereas previously we were like determining the geometry and then producing kind of, the atmosphere from that geometry. This is producing the atmosphere first. And then we have to kind of be very rigorous and logical and go back to the roots of architecture, of kind of the abstraction of plans and sections and things like that, and turn it into a three-dimensional form. So yeah, that's like, I think, one interesting thing, or one concern, let's say, I have about that is that, like I said, it's incredibly cheap. Like it costs a fraction of a penny to make an image. The good part of that is that I see it more like hand sketches. Like, I do hand sketches all the time, and I'm really bad at them as far as like from an aesthetics point of view. I think they're valuable to me because they help me figure out like what I need to do next. But the perspective doesn't make any sense often. Scale doesn't make any sense. Like, they're just like a little doodle to help me figure something out. And that's how I see a lot of these AI images. They might look stunning, but they really are just like a stepping stone, and a very cheap, stepping stone in like a napkin sketch, like something you throw away.
Right.
So that's actually good, I think. My worry is more around because you can do so many so quickly, there'll be this kind of like, oh, we can do more work in less time, so we're going to fill up that extra time that you now have with more work of a different kind. And when I think the problem that the profession has had for generations is that we kind of devalue our work, and we always, because I've heard this so many times from professors of mine and colleagues, and that that architecture is a passion. To be in the profession, you have to be passionate about the profession. And we often obsess over things to the point that it's not good for our health. It's not good for our relationships. It's not good, certainly, for our finances. And we've created this cult around it, around the practice of architecture.
Yes.
And it's maybe okay for a certain group of people who, like, when they're young and privileged, primarily. But as you get older, or if you don't have the same privileges, like if you have to work through school, or you have to take care of a family member, or whatever it might be, it makes the education of an architect very difficult, and a ton of people just drop out because of that. And I feel like we lose a ton of amazing talent because it's almost this like boot camp mentality that, like, if you can't stay up all night and produce ridiculous amount of work, you can't survive in this profession. So I guess my worry around AI is that it just becomes like another tool within that kind of grueling kind of workflow of an architect, rather than a way to kind of emancipate us from more work. And that's, for me, like, the reason I went back in the 90s when I was in undergrad, the reason I even began to use computers, like, there was like 3 computers in the basement of the School of Architecture. And I like, it was, like, it was like the dark dungeon of, like why would you, instead of going from the big high ceiling light and airy studios, going down to the basement? And anyway, the whole reason I did that was because I was really bad at drawing, like, not just sketching, like I said before, but like even worse at drafting. I was very, very slow. I refused to do, because I was so slow, I often just refused to do them. Like, a professor would ask for, a plan of every floor and 2 sections in each direction and so on and so forth. And I'd do like 1 plan, and it would take me like a month to do, and it'd be covered in wet stains and eraser smudges. And I was just like, I wasn't good at all at drafting. And I saw computation as a way to like keep up with my peers. It was like a crutch. It was like, I can't do what they're doing, and I don't enjoy drawing in a way. I wasn't good at it, so I didn't enjoy it. So I thought, like, if I could use CAD, or if I could use FormZ to make a rendering, like, maybe I stand a chance in these reviews. And there were other things I did to compensate as well. Like, if they asked for like a 1/8 inch model or a 16th inch model, I'd produce a 1/2 inch model that was 8 feet long and, came apart and with hinged pieces and, all of that. Like, I was very much at heart like a maker and not a drawer, a drafts person. So I would continue to do these really large models, but then for all of the like 2D work, I just switched to computing, because it was just like a way that I could kind of keep up and not have to like start over when I spill coffee or Coke or something like that on a drawing. So anyway, like, I see my whole drive towards technology in my entire career, I think, is that, like, I want to find ways to make my life easier. And I see AI as one of those ways that, like, despite how much I've been using it, like 30,000 images, I'd say the vast majority, probably 90% of those images, I create when I'm waiting in line at the grocery store, or waiting for my, girls to get out of dance class, or falling asleep at night for a few minutes or something like that. Like, I find like little time here and there, where I would normally just be not doing anything in a way. And I do that just to help me think about my work in a new way. So I think I think it's not a cure-all at all. But I also hope it doesn't kind of, and I'm sure it will to a lot of extent, it's going to take a lot of resistance to this, to like, because AI is like, doing some kind of heavy lifting, let's say, that we then just fill the space that it creates with more work for ourselves. Like I hope we, take that space and go to the movies, or go outside and go on a walk, or whatever it is, because I think, and this is a really interesting part of using AI, because you have to write about the work. It actually rewards people who have better cultural knowledge, historical knowledge. Like, it rewards people who are able to look at a phrase and kind of deconstruct it and rewrite it, edit it, and so forth, and know references to historical periods or movies or artists, art periods, whatever it might be, techniques, tools. And by using these different aspects of like writing about the work, you get better images. And I think that's amazing in a way. Like, it's not rewarding the people who stay up all night, pounding their head against the computer. It's more like if you have a, good cultural and historical understanding, then, so it's almost, in a weird way, I'd say it rewards like more poetic understanding than it does kind of just throwing yourself at the work in a non-thinking way.
Right. Kind of sheer brute force, hours in the day, hours at the desk.
And it's kind of like when you look at AI images, I found that the ones that I'm most drawn to on, let's say, Instagram are the ones created by AI. And I'm like, man, it's kind of, and then I'm like, why am I attracted to these images? Well, it's because they are beautiful. It's because they are poetic. It's because there is a very specific ambiance, like feeling of what this place feels like. And I think it's interesting to use AI as that kind of like a research tool, a thinking tool. And I'm hoping that instead of people just, trying to do drawings based on what images was generated to make this a reality, they would actually, again, think more about how can I create this poetic within the project, and maybe make architecture a bit more poetic than it's been. I feel like, I don't know, like the last 10, 20 years, architecture is mostly just very pragmatic and practical and rational to the point where it's super dry, and maybe some of those images are a bit utopian in the way that they're not realistic in, how the material could hold itself and all of those things, but maybe it's just a way to remind us that architecture should be poetic.
Right.
I think there's two things there. I mean, there's like the good side. I think the positive part of that is, I'd say, like, since I started using computation in the 90s, the vast majority of computational tools have focused on increased efficiency and production in kind of a typical office environment. Like, Revit is a great tool if you're doing a fairly conservative building. And it automates a lot of the mundane tasks, but using it itself as a design tool is a really mundane task. Like, it's not an engaging piece of software, and because it's focusing on production in a way. So it's like you already have an idea about what you want to do, and it'll help you do that. Especially if it's a fairly conventional idea about what you want to do. So I think it's exciting that platforms like Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, it's like one of the first design tools, in the last 30 years that's not focusing on production. It's focusing on concept design. And I think that's great. It's just like so much effort has been put on the other end of the spectrum that I think it's long past time that we have some focus on like the origin of the design.
So go ahead.
Or the other point, though, the negative side of that is that I find it really interesting that you said that the images that you see on Instagram that you're really drawn to, they all end up being like AI images. So the negative side of that, I think it's really it's a huge problem that we're going to have to deal with, is so when the model's trained on all of the images on the internet, or like the Lion 5B data set is 5.8 billion images, like each of those images are given as it's it's being trained, there's another model called an aesthetic predictor, which sounds totally crazy. But there's essentially a model that has been trained on a bunch of images that humans have judged on a score from 0 to 10. So, probably some, at various universities, some students have been hired to look at 1,000 images, and say, give this image, you don't know anything about the image, just give it a score. Is it a beautiful image or is it an ugly image? So that data that was then used to train an aesthetic predictor model, because no one could look at 5.8 billion images and give them a score. So instead they're relying on, I don't know, maybe a few thousand people, probably in the United States, that maybe a decade or two ago gave scores 1 to 10 on a bunch of images. And what Midjourney does is it actually doesn't give you just any image when you prompt something. It's restricting the types of images that come back to you that are probably between, I don't know, 7.5 and a 10. So it's not letting you look at any ugly images.
Right, on the aesthetic scale.
Exactly. So it's incredibly biased towards beautiful in the kind of, often in the Western sense of what beauty is as well. And what's, I think, difficult about that is that obviously it's subjective. So I don't know who the people were that created the model originally, like not created the model, but the people who actually input the data, like the judges, the judges, I should say, that were doing that. But we're now having to deal with their biases in a way where if you, there's a reason that the things in Midjourney that come out tend to have kind of a painterly cinematic effect, aesthetic. It's because most people that look at those things think they're really beautiful. So it's actually almost impossible to make something ugly using Midjourney, which is not great. It's not the way that, like, artists, architects should have the right to produce incredibly ugly things, because that's how new things are created. Anything that's new, anything that's new will inherently be kind of ugly because we're just not familiar with it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I want to ask a few basic questions going back. So we're costs, right? People listening might be wondering, how much does it cost to use Midjourney or Stable Diffusion?
So anywhere from 0 to, I think at my highest month that I ever created anything back maybe in August, I think I spent $200 in 1 month. It's way cheaper now.
Wow.
That the computing time, everything's gotten faster. Computing time's gotten less expensive. Everything is coming down in price. So yeah, like I said, from 0. So if you use Midjourney, I think like you can't. Maybe when you first join as like a trial member, you get like 50 images for free or something like that. I don't remember what it is, but after you go through those free images, you have to have a subscription, and I think their lowest subscription is $10 a month, and the highest is like, I don't know, $60 a month. And I think I use the $30 a month, or I think I don't know. There's an annual plan or something like that, so maybe it's $24 over the whole year. I mean, per month. So anyway, but what's confusing about that is that it's actually the cost in creating the images is in the computing time. So they need to make sure that they can cover the hours in the cloud GPUs, wherever, whatever data center they're using. So there's a cost associated with that. And instead of just making it a flat rate, like the $30 per month, it's actually a certain number of GPU hours that you get per month for $30 or for $10. So if you go beyond that, you're then kind of pushed into you can still create images, but you're pushed into this like lower level where your images won't be processed as fast because essentially the way it works, they're buying like to like Amazon, data center or Google or whoever it is, they're buying like giant blocks of time. So they're going to pay for that time no matter what on those machines. So they're like reserving time on the machines. So they want to maximize the amount of paying customers using those machines. But they're never going, or not never, often they hit capacity on those machines and everything gets much slower. But depending on time zones and when people are waking up and working around the world, the data centers will get busier or slower. So if you've like reached your maximum for like you've used 15 hours of GPU time that month, but you still want to create more, you can kind of get bumped down to this like cheap, basically it's not cheap, but like it's free at that point. Like you can still create more images, but maybe they take 1 minute or 2 minutes to produce or something like that.
It's
or
like
5
a cell
minutes.
phone data plan.
Exactly. So it's like a rate limiting thing where you can still do it, but it's going to take longer. Or, and this is like, my privilege where I'm like, at first in June, July last year, I was like, oh, okay, now I'm down in this rate. I'll just be slow for the rest of the month. And then by August, I was like, no, I have the income that I can pay another $50 to get the fast, to get an image, for the rest of the month at, in a few seconds rather than wait 5 minutes. So that's where the charge is. That's where it can get kind of addictive because you're like, if you want immediate gratification and you want that like kind of this like dopamine hit in a way where you're like, okay, this is what I want. You type, a bunch of words about what you want, like your desires into the computer, and all of a sudden you see, visual representations of that. And so that like feedback, it's hard because it's not like when you do a rendering in V-Ray, like you've done a bunch of testing, you've applied the materials, you've picked the view, everything is kind of, you're getting closer and closer to like what you want, because you know that when you press render, most likely you don't want that to be a mistake. You don't want the render to be done and then it to be wrong. So you do a bunch of testing to make sure it's not going to be wrong beforehand. It's kind of the opposite with Midjourney and Stable Diffusion and things like that, where you type in something, you don't know if it's right, you get an image, you then modify it and so on and so forth. And each time you do it, it's costing money, but you're refining it as you go in a way. So there's no limit to that. There's nothing that says you're done.
Right.
So like the architect, Mark Burry, calls this the stopping problem. And he referred to this like years ago before AI, but it was more in relation to scripting and Grasshopper and things like that. Like if you build a machine as an architect that can produce an infinite number of options, like how do you know when to stop? Like, and for me, I think it comes down to just intuition, where it's like, does it satisfy all the things that I wanted? Do I really need another iteration of this? Or is this enough information for me to go on to move to a different form of media? And be it Grasshopper or Midjourney or whatever it might be, that they can all create infinite options for you. So at a certain point, you've built the machine in a way, you've done all these selections, and you have to like tell yourself, I'm done. Like this is enough, and I'm gonna move it on to another aspect. Yeah.
So for when you're generating options in Midjourney, and let's say again back to our kind of example, it spits out 4, and you want one to be you prefer one over the 4. You want to do iterations based on that. So then you enter in the prompt. I don't know how it works. Okay, based on image 1, produce more options, but give preference to this one. Is that how it works?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different ways you can do it. One is that in Midjourney specifically, there's kind of weird. It all takes place inside of a Discord.
Discord,
like private, Discord private chat room in a way. It's like you and the bot that's producing the images. It's like a long text message chain between you and
that's such
the model.
interesting way to
So do you get to
for
know the
Midjourney
bot?
to decide to use
what's,
Discord.
What's their
like,
favorite color?
do we have to use Midjourney with Bitcoin? Is that part of the deal?
It's coming. It's coming.
No, I hope not. But yeah, I mean, Midjourney specifically made a very explicit decision where they were only, I think, 10 people like who were in the company, and they were like, either we have to hire a bunch of programmers to create an interface for us, or we just use Discord. And like Discord allowed them to scale, right? Like it's designed for anywhere between 2 people to chat with each other up to millions of people to chat with each other. Yeah. So they could rely on Discord's interface, Discord servers, all of that. And they had the limitation though is they had to deal with the interface. And it's like it's a very linear chat. So it's like you see an image and you have 8 options or 9 options. You have the 4 images, and for each image you can either choose to upscale it, so like make the image bigger and at a higher resolution, which it when it upscales it actually adds more information to it, which is it's not like, you know, in like when you're using V-Ray and you do a small little test render and then you change the resolution, you have a bigger render, but it's essentially the same image. With when you upscale an image with machine learning, more information is being added to it, so it'll be a different image. Like maybe the windows aren't in exactly the same place and things like that, which is kind of weird. But then so you have the option to upscale each of the 4 images, or have 4 more varieties of any one of those 4 original images, or the 9th button is just like a reroll. It's like, I don't like any of these 4, just generate them again, you know, like just give me 4 new ones. And then with the variations, if you choose to get a variation of any of them, there are 2 options. One is to give me more variations, and the other is called remix mode, where when you ask for a variation, a window comes up and you can then modify the prompt. So it's going to take the source kind of noise field from the variation that you like, but now you're changing the prompt, so it's going to look in that noise field for something new that wasn't there before, in a way. So like you could change the color, or maybe it's like a building next to a tree, and then you're like, oh wait, that building's really short and squat, I want a tall building next to a tree, so you insert the word tall next to it. But yeah, I mean, just stepping back a little bit, like Midjourney is the most popular one. It's also because I think for a few reasons. One, they have they've tuned their model. So I'm backing up even more. That when I talked about training the data, training the model on data, and then the next part was generating an image. Yeah. There's something in between there that I didn't mention that's really important. And that's called, it's like what the actual programmers are doing is fine tuning the model. So there are what are called weights that the model that are applied to the model, so that it can maybe not produce certain things that the programmers don't want you to produce, like not safe for work content, for instance, with Midjourney, or super violent, anything not safe for work. So they might just put like kind of invisible prompts with your prompt, so you don't see them ever, but it's like filtering out things. Like even if you were to type in something, it's not going to that they don't want you to do, like it's going to filter those things out. So that's like one version of the weights. The other version of the weights, like in a more positive sense, are what I was talking, like the aesthetic model, where it's like they're putting their hand on the scale to produce beautiful images. So that this in between area of the fine tuning is really important. And so I guess I lost track there a little bit, but I think the other thing I wanted to mention, we've talked a lot about Midjourney, but and like the costs associated with Midjourney and the interface and all of that. But there's also a lot of other platforms out there, and each one offers their advantages and disadvantages. So I'm not going to go through all of them,
Sure.
but I think it's important for users to recognize that and not to see like Midjourney as the only solution. So like Stable Diffusion, its two big advantages are that it is an open source model. So you can kind of get in under the hood and kind of see what it was trained on. You can download it for free. You could reprogram it the way you want to if you had the skill. And because you can download it and use it, like it doesn't require access to the cloud, so you can run it on your own machine. And which for architecture students, I think would be, if they're concerned about the cost of, becoming addicted to, like I was saying before with Midjourney, where you might spend a couple $100 in a month if you weren't careful.
No more beer money.
Yeah, that Stable Diffusion, like it's totally free. So if you have like a gaming computer that has a good GPU, you could use Stable Diffusion instead. And I think the open source aspect is really important as well. The way that they've talked about it, that this technology is so important that we shouldn't leave it in the hands of, Microsoft and Google and Apple and Facebook. That because like they're putting their hand on the scale in a variety of ways. Like the programmers are determining the weights on these models of what you can and can't do. And, I don't know if we should trust all of these companies to make those decisions. I mean, I see a lot of I'm not coming down on either side of it at the moment. I think there's a lot of good reasons to restrict the type of content that can be created, but I can also see the downsides of that for a number of reasons. What values do they are they embedding within the model?
Yeah.
And especially as an artist, it seems strange to me that like the tool, like all tools have their own restrictions, but they often don't have restrictions around the content, right? Like they're more related to the technique, what you could do with one paintbrush versus another paintbrush. But to actually have it affect the content, I think can be harmful.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And I think, that is the danger. It's a very strange thing to imagine a future where a high percentages of architects, designers, and artists are using these tools, but everyone is inherently limited through an invisible hand, which is being determined by the people who run a company, a business. It's a very, very, very dangerous path. It goes back to an early point you made of, if you're a creative, you have to be able and allowed to and willing to produce ugly things, or different things which might be perceived as ugly, or ugly things in the process that no one may never see, but you need to see it, and it kind of points to this outcome. I'm not saying this will happen, but this outcome where a lot of creative projects produced are just, everything's flattened within a certain, in this case, as you're describing, like politically correct zone or safe for work zone or whatever other zone that exists, which is a kind of a frightening thing.
I think, there's that aspect for sure. But like all software has their biases, right? Like all the companies, like Autodesk wants to make money. And Midjourney wants to make money, and they're all trying to figure out what's going to please their users the most, because then those users will come back. And I think the problem that I see with Midjourney is one of the problems I see with it. I enjoy using it, but just because I enjoy using it doesn't mean I don't see pretty massive problems with it at the same time. And one of them is that part of their success has rested on the fact that they're using user data to train the model, right? So the initial round of training is like images on the internet, right? But a lot of the images on the internet are garbage, like, ads, images of, like just nothing that's like really all that useful, let's say. And so when a user looks at those 4 images and they select one of them, that's incredibly valuable, like user data that Midjourney collects. So they're saying, based on this collection of words, we presented these 4 images. and the users keep on picking these images that tend to look like this, right? So they've used all of that data for their last few models, and they're retraining the model based on what users like. So the model's getting better and better at certain things. And David Holtz has admitted this back in August. He was like, in his office hours, he's very blunt, and he uses, I don't know, there are probably a few thousand people listening in, users listening in. He's like, look, this model is getting like a lot better at creating like young women. And that's great, but like, I don't know what to do. Like, it's not getting better at a bunch of other things that I think it should get better at. And I don't know if he's like, I don't know if I need to, I'm paraphrasing, but he's like, I don't know if I need to hire a bunch of people to just like start prompting like
dudes,
yeah, dudes, basically. Yeah. And he's like, like, what do I do? Either you all need to start like diversifying your prompts, or I'm gonna have to force it because the model's not learning.
Yeah.
And it's learning, but only in a highly biased way. So I think so they recognize the problem, and everyone's trying to figure this out.
Yeah.
That like if you only train your models on what the users want, or at least what the majority of users want, you're going to like, it's like a inbred system. Like it just keeps on learning only in a certain area, and it doesn't diversify and allow you to do more things. So I think they've prevented this from happening, but back in in October, inspired by an artist and programmer named Chigozie Nuri, she created this Twitter bot called Every Prompt Bot, where it would just send a bunch of random letters and numbers, looks like like a random password, to a latent diffusion model. It wasn't Midjourney, but something else, another similar model, and it would then spit back images. And sometimes they'd be like an image of a frog, and sometimes it'd be an image of a train. But these were completely random phrases. But the model always tries, it's like looking at the cloud, and like no matter what, it's like going to tell you that there's something there, even if the prompt is nonsense.
Gotcha.
So it's crazy. It doesn't, like, if you prompt it with nonsense, it doesn't give you just static. It'll find something in there and try to present a real, an actual image. So I was inspired by her work, and I was like, well, what happens if I do this on Midjourney? Because she was using a different model. And I did that. And I tried it several times, and every single time where it was just random, like 20, 30 characters just randomly strung together, every single time it was young white women who were slightly kind of like injured, which was really incredibly just disturbing, right? That, like,
super disturbing.
Like, it was just like, this is crazy. Like, at least with what Chigozie was doing, that it was like totally random what it would give you back. But with Midjourney, it was always focusing on probably what the like global average of all of its users were plugging in, and where it was like these kind of warrior princesses who had like a scar on their face or something like that.
I see.
And it was like that's insane. They fixed that bug. I'm sure they've, I'm sure the model still wants to produce that, but it was weird. So then I was like, well, there are things called negative prompts where you can, instead of saying, like, a prompt is usually, it's like what you want the model to produce, but you can put negative prompts in, which tells the model what you don't want it to produce. So I put in like woman, girl, portrait as like, I don't want to see those things, but still put in the same random prompts. And it was producing these incredibly crazy, beautiful images of whales and sharks that were dirigibles. So it's like this weird steampunk, biomorphic, like crazy anime, like whales with windows on the side, You know,
Totally
I was like,
normal. You know?
yeah, I was like, how is this possible? It's like you put, and every single time it was always the same thing. Like dozens of
Wow.
times I was doing this, and it was so something very, very odd in their model at that time. I think they fixed it, but it's weird how it's not. I think this is one of the big problems that not just with Midjourney or Stable Diffusion, but even Chat GPT, any of these other things, it's a very different computing paradigm where no one really understands what's going on inside of the algorithm. Because they're essentially prediction algorithms. They're trying to predict what the next most common, next most likely word would be in Chat GPT. And with the images, it's like similar, but it's not words, it's with pixels. So it's like, what's the most common pixel that would be next to this other pixel? And over time, it becomes, a young white woman. And in Chat GPT, it might generate something that's it sounds right, but doesn't make any sense at the same time.
Right.
Like it was a couple of months ago, but I was writing something, and I wanted some quotes I was writing about sketching and AI and how they were similar, kind of what I was talking about before. And I was like, oh, this would be a great place for some quotes by, like, I don't know, Louis Kahn or Le Corbusier on the value of sketching, right? Like architects known for sketching. So I was like, okay, Chat GPT, I want some quotes from Louis Kahn and Le Corbusier on sketching. A few seconds later, produces these quotes, and I'm like, oh my God, these are exactly what I was looking for. These are perfect. So then I was like, okay, give me the citation for these quotes. And it said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you wanted verbatim quotes. I was like,
what?
Like, what's the difference? Like, a quote that's like the definition of a quote. It's like, I didn't ask for a paraphrase.
Yeah.
So then I was like, yes, please give me verbatim quotes. So then it generated verbatim quotes, it said. And I was like, well, then give me, what are the citations? And it gave me some books, and I looked up those books, and they didn't exist. And so it was just like completely fabricating entire books about these architects' work and quotes around it. But the quotes completely made sense. It sounded like they would have been said by Louis Kahn or Le Corbusier. So it's like we have to be incredibly careful around all of this. It's kind of similar to what I was saying before about the column that like starts in the background and ends up in the foreground. It's like when you look at these images or at these paragraphs, they make sense on the surface, but you have to dig into them and question them. And all of the biases that are embedded in it, the way that the algorithm works it's not the way that we're used to an algorithm working. We're used to thinking about computers being super logical and giving you like mathematical, like precise answers. But these are in some ways more like our own brain. Like if someone asks us a question and we don't know the answer to it, we kind of sometimes make up the answer.
Maybe ChatGPT.
Don't make things up.
Maybe ChatGPT found it on YouTube. Someone said it on a video that Louis Kahn made a book. I mean, it all comes back to critical thinking, right? And not just take the information as truth and like do your research and actually question the thing. Don't just absorb and consume it.
Yeah, exactly. So this comes back to you had a question about like teaching Midjourney to students. And like that's exactly why I'm doing it, because it's like I know they're going to be using ChatGPT, they're going to be using Midjourney, whatever, and it's like I'd much rather be kind of in that conversation with them and talking to them about the like ethical and legal and cultural issues, and instead of just letting them use it and learn it on their own completely. Because that's like my role as a professor, is to help guide, students to like use whatever tool they're using in a way that helps them the most. And so, yeah, that was it. And the first class that I taught on this back in January, it was really interesting because in the first, like, usually when I'm teaching like Grasshopper or something like that, it'll take weeks. And I'm still getting questions about like fundamental problems about how the software works. And because it's really hard, like it's really hard to get your head around this super abstract analytical way of thinking that you need to do in order to use Grasshopper or other kind of scripting things properly. But with Midjourney or Stable Diffusion, I felt like I taught like the fundamentals of how the software works in like a half hour. And at that point, it was like all the questions were about big philosophical issues or ethical issues or emotional issues, like students being like, I'm really worried that like about how this is going to affect my job prospects in the future. Or one student, I thought it was really kind of beautiful, like the way she phrased it. She was like, I am an artist and I love sketching. And I love using charcoal and pastels. It's a way for me to relax. And I do these drawings. And I just typed into Midjourney like an idea that I often use in a drawing, and it produced things that are like more beautiful than I can create. And she's like, I don't know how I feel about that. I feel kind of depressed. Like something that I was like that I found so much joy in can now be simulated by this algorithm. And like, does it take away from like what I do as a hobby to relax? And I thought that was, you know, like there are all these issues that like I never had to answer when I'm talking about Grasshopper. You know, and I think that's really good. You know, that it's like these are really fundamental issues that we need to discuss. So I'm
Well, so yeah, on that topic, I mean. Clearly, one of the advantages and qualities of using these softwares is that it's very, very fast and I guess therefore efficient to produce beautiful images of X type and to brainstorm. And, you know, going back a bit also, you were saying that one of the pluses to that is that would give architects more time, and that hopefully we use that time to either take care of our health or to do whatever, instead of just filling in with more requirements to produce things faster. But if the gateway to producing really cool and conceptually interesting images becomes so easy, is the negative then therefore the whole bunch of things you already mentioned? One of them being that for the next generation, they're like, why would someone hire me as an intern if they can just use these softwares? Or even architects, you know, having authorship or controls, not the right word, but being the innovator who produces the beautiful thing. If that goes off the table, because clients can just punch into not ChatGPT, into one of these other programs based on some subreddit that says, oh, just use these prompts to produce whatever style home, and you can do that. And then boom, I don't need an architect for anything creative. Just produce me the CDs, you know, if that, or just go to a builder.
Right. But I think we already have that problem. Actually, so you know, like we already, so it's a problem we have to face, and like, how do we argue for the value of an architect, right? So we already have people like clients going on Pinterest and seeing an image they like, and then thinking that the design is done, and either going to an architect and saying, I want this exactly. Or going straight to a builder and saying they want that, right? So in some ways, there's no difference. But on another hand, maybe it's a positive difference where if a client is writing about their desires and looking at a series of images and, you know, making selections about what they like and what they don't like, that it's in some ways democratized access to the creation of visual imagery, right? Like a lot of people that couldn't normally create an image about what their desire is for a space can now do that. So I think that in some ways it's like really positive, right? And the thing that I think maybe still the reason I think that the architects will still be valuable in this is that just because you can make a beautiful image doesn't mean that that's architecture yet. That there's a lot, and this is like the big misperception. Like people see these images, and because of those images, that type of imagery was always something that was produced at the very end of the architectural process. People think, oh, like the whole design is done.
Yeah.
But now we're getting these images that are beautiful at the very beginning of the design process. But it's almost impossible to get two views of the same space, or two different facades of the same building. Like there's no model. That's what I was saying before. Like it's like architecture without geometry, right? So there's no model. There's no ability to change where the camera is. No understanding of structure. Very little understanding of material. So I think the architect's role will still be to help refine the different desires that the client has, like aesthetic desires, financial desires, and do the work that we normally do. But we'll be able to have, I think, maybe a much higher conversation, because traditionally the tools that architects use early on in the design process were like, rough plans, sections, things like that, rough sketches. But it often was very hard for the layperson to understand what those things meant. So to be able to have very quick imagery that's very atmospheric, very realistic early on, I think will help the conversation. Like we'll be able to understand each other better. And then we can do the hard work of converting those things into, the more abstract forms of media that we're used to.
Interesting. This opens up a whole dialogue, and it reminds me of a number of conversations we've had recently with architects, and it's related, but not the same. And the conversation was about the clients expecting to see very high quality and high resolution renderings of the work. And we're not talking about AI or anything like that at this point, but just representation questions, right? And a lot of the firms were saying, the partners of firms were saying, like, it's a challenge for us, one, because as we've spoken on this recording, it takes a lot of time and money to do these things, and it's sand in our gears, but also which causes kind of process issues because of that time and money, but also it's kind of as they were saying, like backwards, like the clients are focusing on hyper specific, realistic things when a lot of the architects they want to start fuzzy and have abstract white cardboard models or whatever it might be, and then slowly take the client on this journey of becoming more and more refined. And I think there's a number of reasons for that, and maybe one of them is, frankly, that it gives the possibility for the project to grow and take different directions that you don't know about yet, and allow you to explore and refine as you go. And also, I think it's a way for architects to, frankly, maintain some kind of control, and have some kind of creative authorship and say throughout the process, so they don't just become executors, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I was there, in a lot of, like, early on in my career, I worked for Allied Works Architecture, and my role was, this was like 1999 to 2003 or so, and I worked on like 25 or 30 projects over 4 years, where I was like every week or 2 weeks, I was on a new project, because it was like a competition scheme, or like an invited, competition or something like that. So I had to produce models and drawings and images very, very quickly. And it definitely burned me out, because I was just like 80-hour weeks, and it was good for me as a professor, I think, because I went through very, very fast design rounds, and I could, jump onto an idea and produce a bunch of further versions, iterations on that idea quickly. So it helped me now as a professor, like talking to students, I can jump from student to student to student and help them, develop ideas quickly. But I think, there was always this resistance there, where it was like, well, yeah, we can't do a rendering yet because they're going to just obsess over it. And I totally agree with everything you said. Like it is a problem, but like I said, they're in a way already doing that with like Pinterest and other projects that the client has seen of yours or of other architects and things like that. They already have kind of an image in their head, and part of our job, I think, is to communicate the how fixed certain parts of the design are and how loose other parts are, right? So, like, for instance, a lot of I wouldn't say like the big, you know, museum projects and, you know, luxury kind of projects like that. But a lot of typical projects might start out with a conversation with a client that might have like a mood board and images of like case study projects that maybe inspire the architect. Maybe the client is bringing images to the table. And it's basically just a conversation about like what are our shared values in a way for this project? What are like what's a very rough kind of material palette that maybe or at least if not material, but at least the mood, you know, like what's the type of space that you want. And I think AI can help with that a lot. I think as clients become more sophisticated in using these tools themselves, they'll understand that it's like a cheap sketch. Like these things they're not the finished final renders. Mm-hmm. The other part of that as an architect that I think is useful is like to not think of this as like a all or nothing kind of solution. Mm-hmm. That one of the most interesting things that I've found in my own workflow, and I'm seeing other people use these tools, are instead of thinking of it only as a text prompt, there are other inputs for prompts. So one of them is image prompts, and then there are a variety of types of images that you can use. So for example, I recently took the 3D model of Confluent Spark that I did with Lake Flato, the Rhino model of that, and I produced a depth map from the 3D model, which is in Rhino. It's like show z buffer, I think is the command. So you know it happens in a second, and you have this black and white image where things that are in the foreground are white and things that are in the background are black. So it almost looks like this kind of foggy image. So you don't really. It's almost like a mask. Like you just have a sense, this like ghostly image of the 3D model. And I took a screenshot of that and then plugged that into Stable Diffusion, but using a special kind of plugin for it that, or a specialized model that's been trained on depth maps. So it knows how to look at the depth of an image. So it's not looking at the color of the image or anything like that. It's just trying to figure out what the depth of the image is. So you can either put any image into that and it'll try to figure out the depth of the image, or you can just give it straight a pre-calculated depth map. So I got the depth map out of Rhino, plugged it in, and then I could say, you know, like basically use the overall kind of composition of that depth map and the depth that it's indicating there. But say, I want this out of metal scaffolding and not concrete, or I want it made out of wood, or made out of like megalith, you know, like Stonehenge or something like that. Mm-hmm. So you could like riff on this. You could use a 3D model, or you could even take a photograph with your phone of a cardboard model, and use those photographs, like something really rough and sketchy that you've done in Rhino or whatever software, or something that you've built by hand with glue gun, you know, and X-Acto, and that's super rough, but then use that as the input to help you generate variations of it. So I think what I'm trying to say is that you can get the best of both worlds there. Like you could still have a very rough, shaky, you know, loose output of, so the design isn't fixed in a way, right? Like it's very fluid early on in the design, but you can say, okay, I know I want a big grand space, you know, of some kind, and then you model just a simple box in Rhino and use that as the input for the image generation, right? So you can get the best of both. Like you can have the control that you might normally want within the early design process of, you know, not purely relying on your ability to describe something through language, but to describe it through some of the traditional tools that we've been using for generations, like hand sketches and physical models, 3D models, and so forth.
It sounds like this is through a plugin, though, right? And I was wondering if there are dedicated softwares and companies that are image-to-image process as opposed to text-to-image.
I haven't actually looked at it, but I think Revit, Autodesk announced that in the latest release of Revit, they already have this built in, which freaks me out a little bit, but that essentially it just it closes that loop. Like rather than having to go from Rhino to this depth map and then inputting it into Stable Diffusion with this plugin called ControlNet, that they've just, built that all into Revit so that it just looks at the 3D model, uses the depth map of the 3D model, and then you can say, an office building with a glass facade, or a mass timber building with a wood facade, and that you don't have to apply any materials. You don't have to figure out the sunlight or the light. You could just say a night rendering, and it knows what you mean. So it's a huge savings on labor, and it allows you to test out hundreds of ideas very, very quickly, so that you don't have to model every single louver on a building, for instance, or something like that before you even know if you want louvers or not. You could just say a facade covered in louvers, and it knows kind of what louvers are, and it knows what a night rendering is and things like that. So it'll know to make the louvers kind of backlit. And so I think it's as long as you're kind of comfortable with that 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 it's not a finished design and that you still have a lot more control. And as long as the client knows that it's if you think about it as a sketch, then I think it can be useful. But it's going to take a lot of kind of re-education on both sides.
Yeah, I think one of the points you brought up earlier, which is really sticking with me and I'm going to have to continue to think about, is this almost reversing of the process where previously we would do very rough things and then the nice looking, aesthetically pleasing images would come at the very, very, very end, sometimes too late, I would say. And now we have the possibility currently, and with these programs, they're going to increase and proliferate and become better, that whole thing is going to be completely jumbled up entirely. And I have to think about this, wrap my brain around it for sure. I did want to ask, so, and we might have touched on it already, but for students who are current architecture students, or they're considering going into architecture, of course, the big question is this profession going to still be around when I graduate, or maybe not even that broad scope, although we get asked that question. Am I going to be able to find a job when I graduate? Because again, what I have to offer, the past 15 years has a lot of it has been students have to offer is production on the rendering side, on the Photoshop side, on that stuff, less the building construction technical aspects. Right. So, do I have, I guess, job security, basically what the question is. Do I have that when I graduate? And being that you're a teacher, you must get asked this question all the time.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, well, number one, I've been confronted with this question since I was a student, because when I was a student and I started using computers, a lot of the pushback was from my professors. And they were saying oh, well, the computer is just doing this for you. You're not learning how to be an architect. You're not learning how to draw. This isn't architecture because the computer did it for you. And I mean, obviously I disagreed with them, and no professor now would say that about using CAD or Rhino or anything like that, right?
Yeah.
We've integrated software into the discipline, and we're still designing. We found the tools might be different, but and definitely the process is different, but there's still the job of an architect. And I think some jobs will disappear, probably. Some jobs will transform, but new jobs will be created in this, right? And that's been the case for hundreds of years. So with every new technology, there is a combination of job loss, job transformation, and just new jobs. So I'm not that worried about it in that respect. I'm more worried about students going in and expecting oh yeah, for the next few years, my job is only going to be creating images because that's what my professor did when they got a job. That I think they will have to be maybe they'll be using Midjourney or something like that, integrated into Rhino or Revit or whatever. But they're still going to have to go through the hard process of making decisions about what. So this brings me around into I think another really important point of why I like using these So I was talking before about how we are training the model, right? Like our choices train the model, and there's kind of good and bad aspects of it. On the good side is supposedly it'll get better at what I want. The bad side is that it's going to get better at kind of the global average of what people want. And it becomes becomes more biased. So the converse of all of this is also true, though, that the more I use these tools, the more I look at images and then have to make a judgment call, like which of these four is the image that best relates to my idea for the project, or which of the four do I think is most viable for the criteria of this project. That is training my own brain, right? Like the whole reason that we travel the world, that we go to architectural history classes, that we do iterations in design studios, is to help create a design sensibility. That we need experience, we need to fail, number one. Like we need to do something and do it wrong, learn from that mistake, so that hopefully in the future we don't do it wrong again. We need to travel to broaden, just what we see, and to see how other people might do something. We need to study history and all of that to help create a design sensibility. So I think in my own use of these tools, I think it's training my own mind, which might sound a little scary, that like working with AI, that it's like training me, but it's like just looking at the world trains me. So it's like I don't really see too much of a difference. Like I have to use my critical judgment, of like when I see that tree, is it an important tree? Is it something that I should really remember and dream about at night and embed that imagery in my neural pathways? Or is it just like an average tree that just helps reinforce treeness in my head? The same for a building. Like, is it just a building that has no significance in my life when I see it? Or is it something that is really important and will affect me in some way? So if I'm already doing that with the experience of the world, like anything I see, then of course the same thing is happening when I look at 30,000 images and make a decision on each one. Like I'm becoming, I think, or I'm not, maybe I shouldn't make a judgment call, like it's saying I'm becoming better, but it's definitely reinforcing certain things in my brain and maybe other things I'm forgetting about. I don't know. But I think that's probably the most important thing for a student, is to develop a sensibility about design and the relationships between, like, if you look at an image and you're like, okay, that's expensive, or that's not buildable, or that's incredibly inspiring, and I don't care if it's expensive and not buildable, but I got to still figure out a way to do that, then that's great, right? Like that's what we should be teaching students to do. Like they should be able to like quickly evaluate the world around them, like the models they make, the drawings they make, the images they make, and make decisions around them, and feed that into their design process and to make further decisions later on. So I think for students, I don't think having a understanding of Midjourney or any of these tools is essential starting out, and maybe even going through, maybe it won't be essential, but no matter what tool they're using, being critical of it and using it in a way that helps them learn from its use and make decisions, or to fail sometimes and learn from those failures, is the most important. So if you do that, no matter what tool you're using, in a way, I think you will probably get a job and probably be good at it. If you are not critical of the tool, no matter what tool it is, Revit, Rhino, Midjourney, whatever it is, if you're not critical and you just accept the first thing that you see and the easiest thing, then you're not learning very much, you're not progressing, and you won't do very well in a job. So I think that's why I'm not that worried about job loss or anything like that. That it's like, it's all going towards making us think more about what we see and what the implications of those things are. And then how we might transform them through a different lens, like through a structural lens or through a financial lens or through a community lens, whatever it might be, and move on from there.
We were in fact talking to an architect the other day who's much, much older than us. and he's far removed from AI and all the tech we're talking about. But the subject of AI, of course, came up, and he had initially a similar kind of view. He was like, look, it's like, I've been around a long time. First, it was this thing that was going to like destroy architecture. Then it was that thing that was going to destroy architecture. And it's like, it's the same, the core principles of what you need to know. And even in some ways, the truest value of the architect, which is sometimes elusive or not quite easy to understand, is that's also intact, right? These are just new tools. I think that the reason why Midjourney and programs like this, you know, are even more, frankly, frightening to a lot of people is because we're not talking about, you know, before we're using Maylines, but you had a blank piece of, you know, trace paper or whatever it was that you taped down. And in Rhino, it's much more sophisticated, but you still have blank 3D computer space. And the same thing with Midjourney. But I think what really shocks people is how quickly and easy it is to produce something that, as we've talked before, is so aesthetically pleasing and looks final that it is actually, as you've basically described, it's deceptive because it's not everything we maybe allow ourselves to think it might be when we're shocked by it, because there's still a lot of things missing. I mean, I think that it makes, I also appreciate and admire like what you're doing with the education of all of this, because it makes total sense that if there's a new tool that's probably going to be around for the future and again continue to grow, I don't think it's going away.
No.
That that architecture, right? Like we have to understand and teach these things and learn how to work with them. And if we don't, then I feel that's the more dangerous path. And I'm sure you would agree, to just let the new generation of architects, just figure it out or just reject it, you know, in either or, kind of like you were saying. And that simply doesn't work, because then you can produce like it's a shit show then, right? Yeah. And whatever essence there is to architecture can easily disappear if the education is not in place.
Yeah. I mean, I when I taught the class this winter, it was interesting because there were totally different, well, no, actually, I'd say that they were the same problems that I often have in a design studio I was having with students with Midjourney. Like, even though it was a completely different interface, you know, that there were certain students who would look at the image that they would, well, first of all, let me step back, that you were saying like the blank piece of tracing paper or the blank screen in Rhino. I'd say it's actually a similar problem with AI. Like, you have a blank screen where you're just asked, it just says imagine, or in Stable Diffusion it says dream. And then there's like a little text box. And you're like, well, what do I want to imagine? Like, I could imagine anything, right? So it's the same problem. Like, I could draw anything, I could model anything. What do I actually want? So the first step is just like writing about the work. Or maybe it's an image that you're really inspired by. And you're like, of all the images in the world, you know, this case study project or this tree or whatever, I find really beautiful, and I want to see variations on that. So you can use that as an image prompt. So that's the fundamental part. It's like, you have to input something, and then you have to make decisions on it. But getting back to the problems that I have in studio is that some students, they'll create something and it's almost like they're bored by it. Like, they're not curious about what they've made sometimes. And those are the hardest students to work with, because they'll just like make something and they're like, I don't know, maybe this one, maybe that one, I don't know. And like, and you're like, well, what do you mean? Like, which one, like, why would you choose this one versus this one? I don't know. And and it's the same thing that I was having with Midjourney, where like they would like write it, like, oh, I don't know, like, how about a house designed by Taylor Swift?
Oh, okay.
What? Like, you wouldn't do that in studio in a way, like, or maybe they would.
I'm very like, curious about that.
They were using, like, their critical thinking skills, and they were just like, this would be fun, you know, or you know, house designed by Godzilla or something, you know, and you're like, what? Like, you know, like, be a little more critical, a little more curious about how to use this. And like, some students would just like take the first result and like, yeah, it looks pretty cool, great. And they would like submit that. And other students should be like refine, and, you know, really ask critical questions like, why is this happening? Like, I keep on doing this and I keep on getting this weird result. Why is that happening? And those are in both cases, in studio or in this AI class, they're the best students to have because like they have a driving curiosity about the world and that they want to iterate more again and again and try to get at something that is closer to their idea. Or sometimes they don't even know what their idea is, but they want to generate a lot so they can help refine and think about what's most important to them. And then there are other students who I think they treat it more like, just tell me what architecture is and how to do it, and I'll just follow the steps, and then I'll get it done.
It's a great point, though. That's nothing new. That split between, I mean, there are obviously students that fall kind of between the gaps, but that split between student A and B, as you're describing, has always been the case, and it's always been the challenge. The times I've taught of the students who are, as you said in the last example, just tell me what to do, what it is. It's like, man, that's not, it's not it. You know, there's a fundamental kind of mind shift that needs to take place.
Like finding out like what makes them curious about the world is usually the thing that is the best way to get at that. Like I remember this was years ago, like 10 years ago, but I changed the way I was teaching at the time because I was probably the way that most of us were taught was that your professor gives you a site and gives you a program at the beginning of the term. And somehow there's some site analysis, program analysis, and somehow through that analysis, some light bulb goes off and you're supposed to have a concept and then develop that concept. And I've always actually struggled with that a little bit. Like sometimes it is something about the site or something about the program that's really important to me. And I mean, this might sound like blasphemous in some ways. It's like everything that we've been taught probably for the last 50 to 100 years, that those are the two critical things driving everything about architecture. But for me, it's often not that. It's often like something about the atmosphere or something about the fabrication that really engages me. And it doesn't really matter if it's a library or a museum or a house or whatever. I'm going to like come back to that idea again and again and again. And that's what's driving often my process. And so anyway, I decided like 10 years ago to change the way I was teaching. And instead of giving students a program and a site at the beginning of the studio, I often ask them to like, what's like a way of making, like a system, like a fabrication process or some type of system for fabrication that they're curious about. And maybe they have some experience with it, maybe they don't, but that they really want to learn more about. And they don't, so I give them, I haven't done this in a few years, pandemic and everything, but I would give them about 5 weeks to become kind of like master a way of fabrication. Like, so some students would learn how to weld, and other students would learn carpentry or casting or whatever it might be, sewing. And then 5 weeks into the term, I would give them the project and say, it's a ferry terminal in Seattle. So now that you know a certain way of making, how do you adjust the parameters of that craft? Like the material parameters, the tooling, dimensions, all of these things, and tune it so that it works for a ferry terminal or a house or whatever it might be. And what was the most shocking to me in that entire process is that, number one, it aligned very much with my own process. That wasn't shocking at all. What was most shocking was that students who I'd been like warned about by other faculty, like, oh yeah, they're going to be a tough one for you, like they barely finished my studio, things like that, versus the students that I was like I was told like they're the star student, like you're going to have such a great time with these students. It was almost the exact opposite. Like the students that struggled previously in the studio were like the star students all of a sudden. And the students who like were the star students completely struggled. They're like, they would start the studio like, oh yeah, I guess I'm interested in welding. I don't know. And they'd try that and they're like, oh, this is hard. I'm going to do carpentry. How about that? And they're like, oh, wait, this is hard. And they would just like get from one way of making to another and never really iterate and learn like the technique to the point where they could design with it. So I think I don't even know where this story started. Definitely went on a tangent, but like to me, it's really important to like that taught me that it's like for each student, there's a different way to get to them.
Yeah.
And for me, it was through making, and for other students, it might be through reading or history or theory. For other students, it might be much more analytic and it's about the engineering of it, or other students about community and program and things like that. And there's not like one hard and true way to get at a project, and each student will develop their own path through it. And I think, but too often we relied on the site and the program being the generator of everything when there's just so many other ways to approach a design project.
Interesting. We are smack out of time. These 2 hours blew by. Andrew, thank you.
Mostly about AI.
I mean, thank you so much for making the time on a Monday to be on the show. I think we will definitely continue the conversation. Much more to cover about everything. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this video on YouTube. If you like what we're doing, then please support our show by hitting that subscribe button and liking and commenting on our videos.
You can also find us on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're mostly on Instagram. And you can reach out to the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message or leave a voicemail if you have any reaction to this recording, any questions you might have, or guest suggestion. Feel free to send it our way.
Cool. Thank you for watching, and see you next week.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.